20,000 voices rise in Houston's Lakewood Church until one man in the back refuses to stand. Security closes in, cameras swing, and Joel Osteen's perfect broadcast begins to crack. The silent stranger is Keanu Reeves. Is he defying the church or saving it? What happens next, no one is ready for. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sunlight over Houston filtered through the towering glass panels of Lakewood Church, scattering like prisms across the vast interior. The old arena, once home to roaring basketball crowds, had been reborn into something entirely different. A spiritual coliseum where spectacle met salvation. Every inch gleamed. Every sound was tuned to perfection. It was a Sunday of precision, not passion. 20,000 people filled the seats. A sea of movement under synchronized lighting. Cameras glided silently on rails, catching every smile, every raised hand. High-definition screens magnified the pulpit until the man on stage appeared larger than life. At the center of it all stood Joel Osteen, beaming beneath a halo of engineered light. His suit was immaculate, his timing flawless, his tone rising and falling like a practiced melody. "Joy is a choice," he declared, his voice warm, the rhythm controlled. "No matter your struggle, you can choose joy. God didn't bring you this far to leave you empty." The crowd responded on cue. Applause rolled through the arena like a wave. The choir behind him began their cue, a shimmer of harmonies filling the air. The cameras cut to the front row, where hands lifted high. The image was immaculate faith packaged for millions watching from home. But near the very back, beyond the spotlight's reach, a man entered quietly through the side aisle. His black hoodie was pulled low, his jeans simple, his sneakers worn. No one noticed him at first. He didn't move like a man seeking attention. He moved like someone searching for something he couldn't quite name. He chose a seat in section 24, far from the stage, setting down a small notebook beside him. Keanu Reeves had spent his life surrounded by noise film sets, press conferences, cameras that never blinked. But lately, that noise had begun to echo. Between projects in Houston, he had heard of this church, this place where people came to feel joy performed. Curiosity had brought him, not fame, not faith. Just a quiet question he'd carried too long. What happens when belief becomes a show? Around him, the service intensified. The choir rose to a crescendo. Lights strobed in time with the beat. Technicians in the booth whispered into headsets, monitoring camera feeds and crowd shots. Joel's face filled the screens. His smile looked perfect from every angle. Keanu remained still. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes moved slowly across the congregation, taking in the polished production, the uniform rhythm of faith performed in perfect harmony. He didn't stand when the crowd did. He didn't clap when cued. He simply watched. A few nearby attendees noticed. They glanced at him, puzzled by his stillness amid their worship. Some frowned. Others whispered. In an environment built on collective participation, silence felt out of place. Down near the control booth, a voice crackled through a headset worn by the head of security. "Marcus, we've got someone in section 24 not participating. Looks odd." Marcus Hall straightened immediately. The former Marine had run Lakewood security for 7 years. His job wasn't about faith, it was about order. He glanced toward the far section, scanning for disruption. His jaw tightened as he spotted the lone figure sitting motionless while everyone else rose in synchronized praise. He adjusted his earpiece. "Copy that," he said quietly. "Keep eyes on him." And in that single moment of stillness, unnoticed by most, the spark of something extraordinary began. From his post near the mezzanine, Marcus Hall watched the back section carefully. His instincts were sharp. trained by years in the military and refined by thousands of services inside Lakewood's towering walls. The man in the black hoodie wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't filming, wasn't talking, wasn't disturbing anyone, but something about his stillness drew attention, and in a place built on movement, stillness looked like defiance. Marcus had worked security for hundreds of events, from celebrity galas to charity concerts. None demanded more coordination than Sunday service at Lakewood. Every usher, every camera, every lighting cue followed a detailed playbook. Even spirituality here had a rhythm. The sight of someone not participating, especially in a sea of raised hands, was a visual dissonance. It broke the pattern. Joel's voice thundered through the speakers, smooth and flawless, while the giant screens captured every perfectly timed smile. "When life gives you trials, choose gratitude," he said. "When people wrong you, respond with peace." His delivery was precise, a blend of confidence and comfort that had made him one of the most watched pastors in the world. The audience responded as one, shouting "Amen," as if cued by an invisible conductor. Cameras swept the crowd again. Technicians monitored angles, cutting between shots of Joel and the worshipers. The scene looked perfect, until one operator noticed the same anomaly Marcus had. "Camera 6, back row left," someone said in the control room. "We've got a guy sitting down." "Is he sleeping?" another asked. "No," came the reply. "He's just sitting." Marcus frowned and started toward the aisle. He didn't rush. He moved with calm authority, the way a professional handles a potential problem before it becomes visible. His polished shoes echoed softly on the marble floor. Around him, the congregation swayed to the music, oblivious. Keanu sat quietly as the pastor's words echoed around him. He wasn't judging. He wasn't resisting. He was listening. But the louder the music grew, the quieter something inside him felt. He had lived long enough to see how easily faith could become performance. His mother had once prayed every night in a small apartment, whispering to God as if he were sitting beside her. No cameras, no lights, no audience. Just honesty. He exhaled slowly, watching as the congregation around him lifted their arms toward the screens, faces glowing in reflected light. It was beautiful, in a way, but also fragile. He wondered if any of them could hear themselves think beneath all that sound. Across the arena, Marcus's earpiece buzzed again. "You see him yet?" "Visual confirmed," Marcus replied. "No threat, just observing." "Copy that. Keep watch. Pastor likes things smooth." The phrase was familiar. Smooth meant no surprises, no breaks in the illusion of control. Marcus glanced once more toward the man in the hoodie. Something about him looked familiar, the jawline, the calmness, but he couldn't place it. Then, over the roar of the choir, another voice came through his earpiece. "Marcus, section 24. Man sitting, not participating. Pastor's asking what's going on." He paused, eyes narrowing. Whatever this was, it had now reached Joel Osteen's radar. Marcus adjusted his tie, glancing once more toward section 24. The man hadn't moved, not once. Around him, thousands of worshipers were standing, clapping, and singing. But he remained motionless, eyes fixed on the stage. There was no tension in his posture, only quiet focus, like someone listening for something no one else could hear. Marcus tapped his earpiece again. Confirmed. One male, mid-50s, calm demeanor, no visible threat. "Pastor wants confirmation," came the voice on the other end. "Handle it discreetly." He sighed and started down the steps, weaving between ushers holding collection buckets. The choir's music swelled, echoing off every surface, but in his headset, the hum of radio chatter cut through the sound. "Keep the cameras off that section," someone ordered. Keanu didn't notice Marcus approaching. His thoughts were elsewhere on the meaning of what he was seeing. The lights, the rhythm, the crowd's synchronized joy, it all felt like theater. He respected faith, but he also knew truth couldn't be choreographed. His heart was still, his expression unreadable. As Marcus reached the lower aisle, he stopped a few rows away and studied the man more closely. Recognition flickered in his mind, but disbelief held it back. Could it really be him? The man from all those films, sitting here in silence like an ordinary soul searching for peace? Marcus pressed his earpiece once more, voice barely above a whisper. Section 24. I see him. Static answered. Then the words that would set the next moment in motion. Copy that. Pastor says check it out. Now. Marcus's jaw tightened. The order was clear. The music roared, the crowd swayed, and far from the pulpit, under the shadow of the arena lights, stillness waited to collide with spectacle. The lights shifted again as the choir faded into silence, and Joel Osteen's voice filled the vast arena. Every word rang with warmth and confidence, shaped by years of practice. His gestures matched the rhythm of his message, perfectly timed, with subtle music rising beneath him. The service was running like clockwork, but in Section 24, something small but unsettling began to ripple through the crowd. A few heads turned. Whispers traveled like static. In a sea of standing bodies, one man remained seated calm, motionless, hands folded in his lap. His stillness looked almost deliberate, almost sacred. Yet in the world of spectacle, anything that didn't move with the current looked like resistance. Marcus Hall stood at the base of the aisle, watching carefully. His instincts told him this wasn't a threat. The man wasn't agitated. He wasn't filming or protesting. But still, he didn't fit the pattern. Marcus's training pushed him to act when patterns broke. The arena thrived on rhythm. One break in rhythm drew eyes. Too many eyes drew cameras. And cameras were the last thing Joel Osteen wanted focused anywhere but the stage. On stage, Joel's voice swelled with enthusiasm. You can't control what happens around you, but you can always control your attitude. When the world tells you to give up, choose joy. The crowd erupted in applause again. The moment was perfect except for the one person not clapping, not rising, not swaying to the music. The man in black simply sat there, quietly watching, his expression thoughtful rather than awed. Keanu Reeves barely noticed the eyes on him. His thoughts were far from the massive screens, the booming sound system, the synchronized voices. He remembered something softer, a flickering candle on a kitchen table, his mother's hands folded, her lips moving in whispered prayer. She had believed in kindness more than doctrine, in grace more than grandeur. He had come to Lakewood not to challenge it, but to understand. Somewhere along the way, he had begun to feel disconnected from the world that seemed to worship spectacle more than sincerity. Even in his own career, he'd seen the same pattern, how fame could hollow a person, how performance could replace purpose. He wondered if faith could suffer the same fate. The choir swelled again, echoing through the steel rafters. Keanu blinked slowly, his mind drifting between memory and observation. Around him, hundreds lifted their hands to the ceiling, seeking something unseen. Yet, the louder the room became, the quieter his heart felt. He breathed deeply, grounding himself in that stillness that had always been his refuge. Down near the aisle, Marcus's radio clicked again. Any change? Negative, Marcus replied. He's still seated. A pause followed. Then another voice came through, more insistent. People are noticing. Pastor might address it soon. Marcus frowned. The tension in his jaw tightened. Let's hope not. But as more people turned their heads, the tide of curiosity began to grow. What started as a whisper was about to become a wave. The wave of curiosity moved slowly at first, then began to spread through the rows like a quiet tremor. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was the kind of subtle, collective awareness that shifts the atmosphere before anyone can explain why. A few worshippers nudge their neighbors, glancing toward section 24. The same question passed silently from one face to another: who was that man, and why wasn't he standing? From his vantage point, Marcus Hall saw it all. His eyes tracked the subtle shift in energy. The paused way a single motionless figure could disrupt 20,000 synchronized movements. He didn't need to check the monitors. He could feel the tension even from the floor. That man's stillness had weight. It was quiet, but it drew attention like gravity. "Camera 5, avoid that section," a producer's voice said through Marcus's earpiece. "Keep it clean for broadcast." "Copy," Marcus replied, his tone clipped. He glanced toward the stage. Joel Osteen hadn't noticed yet, or if he had, he was too experienced to let it show. The pastor moved across the platform with confident ease, his voice full of practiced warmth. "When you plant seeds of faith, you can't see the harvest right away," Joel declared, smiling. "But don't worry. God's timing is perfect." The audience responded right on cue. Thousands of voices echoed back, a chorus of affirmation. Cameras panned the aisles, capturing the beauty of unity. But every lens deliberately avoided the back section, where one man quietly refused to blend in. Keanu's gaze remained steady on the stage. He wasn't judging. He wasn't resisting. He was simply present. The performance in front of him was powerful, but he could feel how rehearsed it was. There was precision, but no surprise. Emotion, but not depth. His mother's prayers had been messy, imperfect, human. This was immaculate, and strangely, hollow. He thought about how she used to tell him that God didn't need performance, only honesty. He remembered her sitting by his bedside when he was a child, whispering the same prayer every night. She didn't need an audience to believe. The world had changed since then. Everything now was for display, every act of kindness recorded, every word of faith polished for applause. He wasn't sure where truth lived anymore. Marcus moved closer to the aisle, his posture upright, his steps deliberate. The closer he got, the more certain he became that the man wasn't a threat. But that certainty didn't make his job easier. He knew the church's culture. Every detail was designed to maintain image. Even small disruptions mattered. He spoke softly into his mic. Approaching section 24. "Proceeding for assessment." Static crackled. "Understood. Keep it discreet." The crowd erupted again as Joel's sermon reached another high point. The choir behind him launched into song. The lights brightened and the music filled every corner of the arena. For a moment, the energy was almost overwhelming. But in that ocean of sound, one still point remained a calm center in the storm. Keanu Reeves didn't move. And for the first time that morning, Marcus began to feel like maybe he wasn't looking at a disruption at all, but it's something he didn't fully understand. The sermon built toward its peak. Joel Osteen's voice carried through the massive space, amplified by flawless acoustics. "When you stand in faith," he declared, "God will stand with you." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Thousands rose to their feet again, clapping, shouting affirmations, hands raised to the ceiling. But in that sea of movement, one man stayed perfectly still. The lights rippled across faces like waves, bouncing from one worshiper to the next, but the man in the black hoodie remained untouched by the rhythm. His stillness stood out more than any gesture could. It was quiet yet commanding, calm but somehow defiant. Not in anger, but in conviction. People near him began to react. A few tried to coax him gently to stand. One woman smiled and whispered, "Come on, brother, join us." He nodded politely, but didn't move. The silence around him deepened as others noticed. In a room designed for unity, individuality suddenly felt like rebellion. Marcus Hall reached the edge of the aisle and stopped. From where he stood, he could see the man's face clearly now. The lines around his eyes, the quiet composure, the unmistakable familiarity. It took him a few seconds to process what he was seeing. Then his pulse quickened. He whispered under his breath, almost disbelieving, "No way, that's Keanu Reeves." The name wasn't shouted, but it didn't need to be. It traveled like a secret catching fire. A few people turned, then a few more. The hum of recognition spread through the section. Phones began to appear, discreet at first, then openly. Some started filming. Up on stage, Joel Osteen sensed the shift. Years of performing had tuned him to every tremor in the crowd. He noticed the sudden break in attention, the murmuring from the back, the glint of raised screens. His eyes flicked briefly toward the balcony, but the spotlights blinded him from seeing details. In the control booth, one of the technicians leaned forward. "Pastor, there's movement in section 24, came the voice through Joel's discreet earpiece. "We're handling it. Make it smooth," Joel murmured quietly, never missing a beat. He smiled. Wide, kept his tone bright. "When you stand in faith, God will stand with you," he repeated, louder this time, hoping to pull their focus back. But the words hung awkwardly in the air, their irony invisible to him. On screen, the camera panned the audience. Thousands of faces appeared, illuminated by spiritual enthusiasm. And there, in the back of the room, a single figure remained seated. His stillness radiated a different kind of power. Not spectacle, but presence. Marcus lowered his hand to his radio. "Pastor's aware," he said softly. "Do we intervene?" A pause followed, tense and loaded. Then came the order, clipped and clear. "Approach him, discreetly." Marcus's jaw tightened. He nodded to a nearby usher, signaling him to stay alert, then stepped into the aisle. The music thundered. The choir swelled, and the congregation stood in worship. But beneath that perfect surface, tension coiled like a hidden wire. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief moment, unaware of the storm forming around him. To him, the noise faded. All he could hear was the faint echo of his mother's voice, a memory of gentleness in a world that now demanded constant performance. He opened his eyes again, and his gaze drifted to the stage. Joel Osteen's words rang across the hall, confident, booming, absolute. "When you stand in faith, God will stand with you." And as the camera swept past, capturing the endless ocean of believers, it lingered for just a second too long on the only man who didn't move. The silence he carried was about to change everything. Marcus Hall moved down the steps quietly, his polished shoes nearly soundless against the floor. The choir's song was ending, the energy of the crowd still electric. 20,000 voices had just declared their faith together, but the one voice missing, the one silence lingering, had pulled the entire room slightly off balance. Marcus felt it like static in the air. He stopped 2 rows away, keeping his posture calm and open. The man in the hoodie hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't looked away from the stage. The way he sat straight-backed, composed, still radiated a strange authority. Marcus's instincts whispered, "Don't rush." He cleared his throat gently and leaned closer, his tone polite but firm. "Sir," he said, low enough not to disturb the people nearby, "we encourage everyone to participate during the service." The man turned his head slowly. His eyes were soft, kind even, but steady. "I'm participating," he said. His voice was calm, smooth, and almost meditative. "Just in silence." The answer caught Marcus off guard. It wasn't defiant. It was peaceful. He nodded slightly, unsure how to respond. Before he could speak again, the man gave a small, understanding smile, as if he knew exactly what Marcus was feeling. Then, Recognition flickered across Marcus's face. He blinked once, twice, his heart suddenly quickening. He leaned back slightly, studying the man's features. Again, the jawline, the eyes, the voice. There was no mistake. It was him. "Sir," Marcus said softly, his voice almost slipping. You're Keanu Reeves." The moment the name left his lips, the air changed. A woman 2 rows over turned her head, her eyes widening. Then a whisper spread through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. "That's Keanu Reeves." The phrase echoed again and again, each repetition louder than the last. Phones began to rise, camera flashes flickering faintly despite the dim lights. Some gasped, others pointed. The perfect rhythm of worship fractured into restless murmurs. Up on stage, Joel Osteen was mid-sentence when the wave of distraction reached him. His rhythm faltered, only for a split second, before he recovered. He smiled wider, pushing through his sermon, but he could feel the crowd slipping away. The attention that had always belonged to him was being pulled to the back of the room. Lisa Osteen, sitting in the front row, noticed her brother's hesitation. Her eyes followed his gaze, scanning the crowd until she saw where everyone was looking. At first, she couldn't tell what was happening. Just a cluster of people, turning toward the back, whispering, filming. Then she saw the faint reflection of a camera screen catching a familiar face. Her breath caught. It was Keanu Reeves. And he wasn't there for publicity. He was simply sitting, still as stone, peaceful amid the chaos now blooming around him. Joel Osteen's eyes darted toward the production booth, corners of his polished smile tightening. Years of televised ministry had trained him to handle surprises, but this was something different. The crowd's energy had shifted, and even from the blinding stage lights, he could sense where their focus had gone. The synchronization, the controlled atmosphere, the effortless flow. It was all slipping. He gave a quick hand signal to the music director. The choir, confused but obedient, launched into another uplifting verse. The music filled the air, smooth and deliberate, a curtain drawn to conceal uncertainty. Joel adjusted his mic, his voice rising with practiced enthusiasm. "Let's celebrate today. Let's give God praise for every blessing in this place." The crowd clapped and cheered, though unevenly. Most of them weren't clapping for the sermon anymore. They were clapping for the celebrity in their midst. In section 24, the murmurs thickened. Keanu remained seated, his face unreadable. He didn't look embarrassed or amused. If anything, he looked disappointed, like he had come in search of stillness and found noise disguised as worship. The cameras near the back caught flashes of his profile, and though none had been ordered to broadcast that section, the moment was being recorded on dozens of phones. Marcus crouched slightly beside him, speaking quietly over the roar of music. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice respectful now, stripped of the earlier formality. "I didn't realize it was you. People are starting to notice. Pastor might ask me to move you to a private area." Keanu shook his head slowly. "No need. I'm fine here." "I understand, sir, but it's starting to cause—" "I didn't come to cause anything," Keanu interrupted softly. His tone wasn't defensive. It was almost gentle. "Sometimes peace makes people uncomfortable." Marcus hesitated, caught between policy and intuition. He had been trained to de-escalate conflict, but this wasn't conflict. It was presence. The quiet confidence radiating from this man made the idea of removal seem absurd. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "if I can just explain to Pastor—" "Do what you need to do," Keanu replied, glancing back toward the stage. "I'll just be here." Lisa Osteen leaned forward slightly in her seat, hands clasped in her lap. Something about the man's composure stirred her. It was rare to see that kind of peace unaffected, humble, grounded. She glanced toward her brother on stage. His movements were more deliberate now, His smile, more forced. She could tell he was trying to keep control. In the booth above, a technician's voice came through Marcus's earpiece. "Status update?" Marcus replied quietly. "It's Keanu Reeves." "I repeat, it's Keanu Reeves." There was a pause. Then another voice, unfamiliar, came through Joel's stage manager. "Are you serious?" "Confirmed." Up on stage, Joel caught the faint buzz of confirmation through his own earpiece. For the first time that morning, his practiced expression faltered. He turned slightly toward the crowd, forcing his voice steady. "Well," he said into the mic, the corners of his mouth stretching into a strained smile, "it looks like we have a very special guest among us today." The crowd hushed in anticipation. The air inside Lakewood thickened as Joel Osteen turned his smile toward the back of the arena. The crowd, caught between awe and confusion, slowly quieted. The choir's voices faded until only the distant hum of the sound system remained. For the first time that morning, the mega church, so perfectly rehearsed, felt unscripted. Marcus Hall stood near Keanu, his earpiece buzzing with overlapping voices from the control booth. "Joel's going to acknowledge him," one voice said. "Keep him calm." Marcus didn't reply. His attention was on the man beside him, the way Keanu's calm didn't waver even as thousands of eyes bore down on him. Lisa Osteen felt her heart race as she glanced between her brother and the guest. She could tell Joel was scrambling internally. He had spent his career mastering control of the crowd, of the image, of the message. But now, control had slipped. And yet, there was no malice in this disruption. Only stillness. Only truth. Joel raised his mic again, forcing a chuckle. "It seems we have someone very special with us this morning," he said, his voice smooth but tight. The crowd murmured with excitement. Some clapped, others lifted their phones higher. "Mr. Keanu Reeves," Joel continued, his smile stretching as cameras began to shift. "We're honored to have you here." Every spotlight in the room seemed to tilt toward the back. Keanu didn't stand. He nodded politely, folding his hands together. "Thank you," he said quietly, though the mic didn't pick it up. His voice was swallowed by the enormity of the room. Marcus felt a strange wave of respect wash over him. The man hadn't sought attention, hadn't demanded space. The fame that surrounded him was uninvited, and yet his composure never cracked. Joel turned toward the choir, gesturing for music. "Let's give him a warm welcome," he said, his tone lifting, but the enthusiasm sounded forced. The choir launched into a bright chord, filling the awkward silence with sound. The crowd's cheers rose again, but they were uneven, half admiration, half uncertainty. Some people cheered simply because that's what they were supposed to do. Others stayed quiet, watching the strange scene unfold. Lisa leaned toward the stage manager. "Don't turn the cameras on him," she whispered. "Just let it breathe." But it was too late. Dozens of personal devices were already filming. Within seconds, clips were being uploaded, shared, whispered about online. The moment Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly in a place built for noise, was already becoming legend. Joel glanced toward the back, forcing his grin wider. His voice rang through the mic, bright and polished once again. "Let's take a moment," he said, pausing, "to acknowledge our guest." Applause filled the hall, swelling and echoing against the high ceilings. Keanu inclined his head again, his calm radiating through the room like a slow, steady pulse. The spotlight that once belonged solely to the pastor had shifted to silence, to humility, to something unplanned and uncontainable. And though the cameras turned away, everyone knew the service would never return to its script. The applause inside Lakewood thundered like a storm breaking loose. People rose to their feet in waves, clapping, shouting, and lifting their phones to capture the moment. On the giant LED screens, the cameras zoomed in on the man everyone was now staring at. His face filled the room. Keanu Reeves, sitting calmly in a sea of excitement. The image was crystal clear, magnified to impossible scale. 20,000 people watching one quiet man who refused to move. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his posture relaxed, his expression serene. The contrast was almost cinematic stillness surrounded by spectacle. Joel Osteen smiled wide, his voice booming through the speakers. "Let's give another warm welcome to Mr. Keanu Reeves, everybody." The crowd responded with even louder cheers. Joel gestured toward the back, raising his arm as if inviting the energy to carry Keanu forward. "Brother, why don't you stand and say hello to everyone?" All eyes turned. Keanu didn't move. He looked up toward the stage, his gaze kind, his presence gentle. Then, he gave a small nod, acknowledging the gesture. The applause continued for a few seconds longer, then slowly faded as people realized he wasn't standing. Joel tried again, his tone still cheerful. "Come on, my friend. Just a quick wave for the folks watching all around the world." Keanu's voice carried softly through the vast room, even without a microphone. "Thank you," he said, his tone humble. "But I came to listen." The simplicity of his words rippled through the crowd. The applause faltered, replaced by something quieter: curiosity, confusion, and reflection. The energy that had once been perfectly choreographed now felt human again, unpredictable. Lisa Osteen, still seated in the front row, felt something shift inside her. She had seen countless celebrities visit the church before, each one happy to bask in the spotlight. But this moment was different. Keanu's refusal wasn't arrogance, it was authenticity. It was as if he was protecting something sacred from being turned into a performance. Marcus Hall, still standing nearby, felt a weight settle in his chest. He had spent his life maintaining order, controlling scenes before they could get messy. Yet here was a man doing absolutely nothing, and somehow creating more power than any production ever could. Joel laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension. "Our guest prefers humility," he said into the mic. The audience chuckled politely, unsure how to react. But behind the pastor's practiced grin, there was unease. The moment he couldn't control had now become the moment everyone would remember. The cameras, unsure where to focus, lingered on Keanu's face. On the big screen, his calm expression filled the space, once reserved for sermons. His silence carried more conviction than words ever could. The thunder of applause slowly faded into a curious hush. The crowd, once bursting with enthusiasm, now sat in a strange kind of tension. People weren't sure what to do next. A few tried clapping again, unsure if they were supposed to. Others looked from the stage to the giant screens, where Keanu's calm face remained frozen in close-up. His stillness was disarming. Joel Osteen stood at the pulpit, smile fixed, heart racing. He wasn't angry, but the rhythm of the service had been broken, and that loss of control unsettled him more than he expected. For years, he had mastered the art of direction, knowing when to raise his voice, when to pause for laughter, when to let the choir lift the mood. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for a moment like this, where silence carried more power than a sermon. "Brother Keanu," he said warmly, his tone softening. "It's such an honor to have you here. Would you join us for a quick word? Just to share a thought with everyone watching today?" The invitation echoed through the microphone, bouncing across the vast hall. All eyes turned again toward the back. Keanu's expression didn't change. His fingers brushed together, his head tilting slightly as though weighing the words. Then, with quiet certainty, he shook his head. "I came to listen," he said again, voice low but clear enough to reach the nearest rows. It was a gentle refusal, yet it landed like a challenge. The crowd murmured softly. A few clapped again, trying to fill the pause. Joel chuckled lightly into the mic, the sound a little strained. "Well, my friends," he said, gesturing toward the screens, "our guest prefers humility, and we can certainly respect that." Some in the audience laughed politely. Others didn't. The moment had grown heavy with meaning. Lisa Osteen leaned forward, hands clasped, her eyes never leaving Keanu. What struck her wasn't his fame or his defiance. It was the peace in his face. There was no ego there, no sense of making a point, just quiet conviction. She felt something stir deep inside, a reminder of what worship used to feel like before it became a production. Marcus Hall, still standing a few feet behind Keanu, felt the same unease. He'd worked here long enough to see plenty of excitement pass through these walls. Celebrity visitors, viral moments, perfect Sunday performances. But this was different. The silence had a gravity that words couldn't touch. He wasn't sure if it was reverence or rebellion. Maybe both. On the big screens, Keanu's image stayed fixed, hands folded, eyes calm. The camera operator hesitated, waiting for Joel's signal to cut back, but Joel didn't give it. For a moment too long, the church stared at the man who wouldn't perform. That single refusal became something larger than anyone intended, a mirror reflecting everything this place had become. Joel Osteen stood frozen for a beat too long, his smile unwavering but his confidence shaken. He looked toward the camera operators, then back to the congregation, trying to read the shifting mood. What had begun as admiration was now something quieter, almost reverent. The man who refused to stand had somehow become the moral center of the room. Joel cleared his throat and forced a soft laugh. "Sometimes, friends," he said lightly, "the greatest sermon is the one we don't expect." His voice carried easily, but it couldn't mask the truth. The crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. All eyes were still fixed on Keanu. The applause had faded completely, leaving an uneasy calm in its place. Keanu sat motionless, his presence radiating calm in a space built on noise. The lights from the stage glimmered faintly on his face, and for a fleeting moment, the cameras captured something raw humility in its purest form. Joel felt it too, though he couldn't admit it. This man wasn't trying to upstage him. He wasn't preaching or grandstanding. He was just being. And that quiet beingness had somehow undone years of polish and performance. Lisa Osteen whispered to her brother from the front row, "Let it go. Don't push it." Joel nodded almost imperceptibly, though part of him still fought to reclaim control. He turned toward the audience again, tone bright and forced. "We are honored to have you with us, Mr. Reeves," he said, trying to wrap the moment neatly. "And we thank you for reminding us that faith comes in many forms." The words hung in the air like smoke, well-meaning, but hollow. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some clapped again, unsure whether to sit or stand. Keanu looked up toward the stage, his expression steady, almost compassionate. Then, in a rare moment that no microphone caught, he whispered words meant only for himself. "Faith doesn't need a stage." Marcus heard it. The simple line struck him like a revelation. He looked around at the cameras, the lights, the massive screens, and realized he had never actually prayed in this building, only protected it. Lisa watched Keanu from the front and felt tears prick her eyes. In that quiet defiance, she saw something the church had long forgotten: humility without spectacle, devotion without demand. Joel finally gestured toward the musicians. "Let's continue," he said, his tone softer now, almost humbled. The choir hesitated, then began to sing again, but the energy had changed. It wasn't the same rehearsed joy as before. Something quieter, deeper, lingered in the air. The big screens faded from Keanu's face back to Joel's, yet the image stayed burned in everyone's mind. The man who wouldn't perform, the man who refused applause. And as the final notes of the song echoed through the massive hall, one truth settled over everyone present. The most powerful thing in the room that morning wasn't the sermon, the music, or the lights. It was the silence of a man who came only to listen. The choir's final note faded into silence, and for a moment, no one knew what to do. The energy that had once filled Lakewood like a wave had vanished. The applause had stopped. The laughter had died. Even the rustle of the crowd felt muted, like a great hush settling over the room. Joel Osteen stood at the pulpit, still smiling, but the rhythm that had guided his voice all morning was gone. His practiced charm felt thin now, stretched over a moment that refused to obey his script. The spotlight that once obeyed his every gesture seemed to hesitate, as if unsure where to land. He cleared his throat, trying to recover his footing. "God moves in mysterious ways," he began, his voice warm but uncertain. "Sometimes he reminds us that we are all part of something bigger, something beyond our plans." He paused, glancing toward the crowd, but their attention wasn't fully his anymore. In the front row, Lisa Osteen felt the shift deep in her chest. For years, she had stood beside her brother, supporting his ministry, believing in the message they shared. But today, something about this moment felt different. The sight of Keanu Reeves sitting calmly while 20,000 others clapped and cheered had struck her harder than she expected. It wasn't rebellion, it was reflection. His silence had forced everyone, even her, to question what they were doing. She looked up at Joel, saw the tension behind his perfect smile, and before she could stop herself, she rose to her feet. The movement drew immediate attention. She walked slowly toward the stage, gesturing to a nearby usher for a microphone. Joel turned, startled. "Lisa?" he said, half smiling, unsure what she intended. She took the mic gently, offering a reassuring nod. "Just for a moment," she said softly. The congregation's murmur grew louder, curiosity replacing the earlier excitement. Cameras shifted again, capturing her as she turned to face the audience. Her tone was different from her brother's, less polished, more human. "I want to say something," she began. "Something about what we just witnessed." She glanced toward the back of the room where Keanu sat, still calm, still silent. Sometimes we confuse participation with performance. We stand, we clap, we shout, but we forget to listen. The crowd grew completely still. Joel's expression tightened, his eyes flicking toward the production booth, but he didn't interrupt. Lisa continued, her voice trembling with sincerity. "Maybe the truest form of worship isn't about how loud we sing or how high we raise our hands. Maybe it's about honesty, about presence, about being still long enough to feel something real." Her words landed softly, but their impact rippled through the hall. For the first time that morning, the room wasn't reacting, it was reflecting. Keanu lifted his gaze toward the stage. His eyes met Lisa's for just a moment. There was no smile, no nod, just a quiet understanding between two people who recognized the same truth. The silence in the hall deepened until even the faint hum of the sound system seemed intrusive. Lisa stood firm at the edge of the stage, the microphone resting loosely in her hand. She wasn't preaching, she was confessing. Her voice carried a kind of trembling honesty the congregation wasn't used to hearing in this grand arena of perfection. "For so long," she continued, "we've measured worship by emotion, by what we can see and hear. But what if faith isn't supposed to be visible? What if it's supposed to live quietly inside us, without all the noise?" A few heads nodded in the front rows. Others watched her, uneasy, as if afraid of where her words might lead. Joel Osteen remained frozen behind her, every instinct telling him to retake control, yet something in Lisa's tone stopped him. He could sense the sincerity in her voice, the same kind of sincerity that had built their father's ministry, long before the lights and cameras came. Lisa's eyes swept over the crowd. "We've turned this space into a stage," she said softly. "But God doesn't need a performance. He just needs a heart willing to be honest." The tension in the air was electric. Even the choir stayed still, watching. Back in section 24, Keanu listened intently. He hadn't planned to draw attention. And yet his quiet presence had somehow opened a wound in this room, one that needed healing. Her words echoed what he had felt the moment he walked through the doors. He could feel something shifting, like a wall inside the church beginning to crack, letting the light in. Elder Henry, an old deacon who had served since the church's earliest days, sat a few rows from the front. His white hair caught the glow of the overhead lights, his weathered hands resting on a worn Bible. He had lived through the humble beginnings of Lakewood, when services were held in a modest building with creaky floors and folding chairs. Back then, worship was simple. Just songs, prayers, and people crying quietly in the back rows. He had watched that simplicity disappear under bright lights and broadcast contracts. But as he listened to Lisa speak, tears filled his eyes. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, his voice carrying farther than expected. "Child," he said gently, "that's the truest word I've heard in years." The audience turned to look at him. His voice trembled, but it carried conviction. Maybe the Lord sent this man today to remind us of something we forgot, that faith doesn't need a spotlight to shine. Lisa's eyes softened. Joel's hand tightened on the pulpit, but he didn't speak. For the first time in a long while, the moment didn't belong to him. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, humbled by what he was witnessing. He hadn't come to teach, but somehow the message had found its way through the silence. The atmosphere inside Lakewood had changed completely. What had begun as a polished service had turned into something raw, unplanned, and deeply human. The lights no longer felt dazzling. The air was heavy with emotion and quiet awe. For the first time that morning, the church didn't feel like a performance hall. It felt like a sanctuary. Lisa stood beside her brother, her hand trembling slightly around the microphone. She looked at the congregation, some wiping tears, others simply staring, unsure of how to process what they were witnessing. "We talk about miracles all the time," she said softly. "But maybe the greatest miracle is honesty. Maybe it's when we finally stop pretending and let God see us as we really are." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Joel Osteen's perfect composure was fading. He didn't look angry. He looked unsure. For years, he had believed that positivity was the most powerful message he could offer. But now, standing behind his sister, he realized how fragile that image was, how thin the line between inspiration and illusion had become. He turned toward the audience, his polished voice returning but quieter now, almost hesitant. "My sister has spoken truth," he said. "Sometimes we need to be reminded that joy isn't performance, it's presence." The crowd listened in silence. Some nodded. Others whispered small prayers under their breath. In the far back, Keanu watched the exchange with calm focus. His eyes met Lisa's once again. The look between them carried no words, only understanding, a shared recognition that something real had finally broken through the surface. Elder Henry took a step forward, leaning heavily on his cane. His voice wavered, but it filled the space. "This church was built on faith, not fame," he said. "And today, I think the Lord gave us a small mercy to see that truth again." The room was utterly still. Even Joel felt the weight of the old man's words. They weren't an accusation. They were a plea, a reminder of what had been lost. Lisa handed the microphone back to her brother and stepped aside. Her expression was soft, tearful, yet relieved. Joel hesitated before taking it, staring at the crowd for a long, uncertain moment. The authority he once carried so easily was gone. In its place was something deeper, a dawning humility. He smiled faintly, not the rehearsed one that appeared on television, but something smaller, more human. "Let's take a moment," he said, voice unsteady, "to be still." No music played, no choir sang. 20,000 people sat in silence. For a full minute, the largest megachurch in America stood perfectly still. And in that stillness, Keanu Reeves bowed his head. He didn't preach. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Yet the quiet truth of his presence had done what no sermon ever could. The performance had ended. The faith remained. The silence lingered, fragile but sacred. Joel Osteen stood at the pulpit, unsure how to transition back into the structure of the service. His words, once effortless, now felt small in this vast, humbled space. His instincts told him to regain control, to restore rhythm, to bring back the familiar order. But the congregation's stillness was heavy with something he didn't want to shatter. He looked toward his sister Lisa, who nodded softly, encouraging him to let the moment breathe. Then his eyes fell on Elder Henry, the quiet, faithful servant who had been part of Lakewood long before it became a global phenomenon. The old man sat near the front, his cane resting across his knees, his face reflecting decades of devotion. Joel's heart stirred with both respect and desperation. "Elder Henry," Joel said, his voice echoing through the microphone, "would you come forward and lead us in prayer?" The elder blinked, surprised. Slowly, he rose, leaning on his cane as he made his way to the steps. The cameras followed him instinctively, broadcasting his careful ascent. Unlike the polished grace of Joel's stage presence, Henry's movements were unhurried, each step a testament to time and endurance. When he finally reached the pulpit, Joel handed him the microphone. "Thank you, Elder," he said softly. "Please share what's on your heart." Elder Henry nodded and turned to face the crowd. His voice was thin but steady, resonant with age and conviction. "I've seen a lot of Sundays here," he began. "I've seen this church grow from a few dozen believers in folding chairs to thousands filling this great hall. I've watched the music grow louder, the lights grow brighter, and the sermons reach millions. But somewhere along the way, I've wondered if the noise drowned out the whisper of God." A murmur spread through the crowd. His words, though gentle, struck deep. Henry smiled faintly, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "Today, I think I heard that whisper again, and it came from the quietest place in this room." The camera shifted toward the back section. People began to turn, realizing who he meant. Keanu Reeves, still seated in section 24, sat motionless, his hands folded, eyes lowered. He hadn't expected to be part of this, yet the moment found him again. "The man in the back row," Henry said, pointing gently, "reminded us that faith doesn't need a spotlight to shine." The congregation gasped softly. Some clapped, others bowed their heads. Keanu remained still, his modest posture somehow amplifying the reverence in the room. Henry raised the Bible in his hand, his voice growing firmer. "Matthew chapter 6, he said. "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen." The verse filled the hall like sunlight piercing through stained glass. Elder Henry's voice carried through the air with quiet strength. "Your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." He finished. The final words landed like a gentle blow, powerful in their simplicity. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, somewhere near the front, a woman began to clap. The sound echoed faintly in the massive space. Another person joined her, then another. Within seconds, applause began to ripple through the crowd. Not the synchronized, rehearsed rhythm Lakewood was used to, but something raw, unplanned, and real. The thunder of hands filled the sanctuary, rising higher and stronger. The cameras panned slowly across the faces of the congregation, capturing tears, smiles, and awe. There was no direction from the production team, no cue from the sound booth, just a spontaneous outpouring of emotion. For the first time in years, Lakewood's broadcast felt alive. Keanu bowed his head slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but refusing to interrupt the sacred moment. He wasn't used to being the center of reverence. Fame had taught him how shallow public adoration could be, but this was different. It wasn't about celebrity, it was about sincerity. He kept his gaze down, his hands clasped, feeling the strange mix of humility and weight that came with the moment. Elder Henry turned toward Joel, his eyes kind but steady. "Pastor," he said, "maybe today the sermon has already been preached." Joel stood motionless, his face tight with emotion. He had wanted to regain control, to lead again. But as he looked across the vast room, he realized control was no longer what the people needed. What they needed was truth, and they had found it in silence, not spectacle. Lisa's eyes shimmered with tears as she placed a hand over her heart. The simplicity of her brother's stillness and the elder's faith had combined into something holy. She knew the cameras were still rolling, but for once, that didn't matter. This wasn't about ratings, image, or growth. This was about awakening. In the production booth high above the stage, technicians exchanged bewildered glances. Their monitors glowed with scenes that felt foreign to Lakewood's usual broadcast. No musical transitions, no stage lights chasing emotion, no polished graphics flashing sermon points, just people. Real people. One of them whispered to the director, "Do we cut to commercial?" The director hesitated, watching the live feed. On one screen, Joel stood humbled beside Elder Henry. On another, Keanu sat in quiet reflection. The applause swelled, then softened, becoming a hum of reverence. The director shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Let it roll." Down on the main floor, a journalist named Tina Alvarez sat in the press section, clutching her camera. She had come expecting to film a typical Sunday segment, cheerful, glossy, predictable. But what she was capturing now was history in the making. Through her lens, she zoomed in on Keanu's face, the calm expression of a man unmoved by recognition yet deeply present in faith. The light caught his, features just right. For once, it wasn't a movie shot. It was something purer. The applause faded into an almost sacred quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive. Joel looked out over the congregation, his heart pounding. He had preached to millions, stood on countless stages, but he had never felt what he felt now. Small, human, and strangely free. The performance had ended, and something real had taken its place. Elder Henry lowered his Bible, his voice now soft again. "We've built walls of sound and light around something that was always meant to be simple," he said. "But today, I think we've remembered. Sometimes the smallest flame burns brighter than the biggest show." His hand trembled as he set the microphone on the pulpit. And that flame, brothers and sisters, came from a man who said nothing at all. Keanu sat motionless, trying to vanish into the seat, but there was no hiding from 20,000 eyes. He gave a single, slow nod, nothing theatrical. Just acknowledgement. And the gesture carried through the entire arena. A few people began to stand. Then, more. Within seconds, hundreds rose to their feet. Not in choreographed excitement, but in reverence. It wasn't a standing ovation for fame. It was for truth. Keanu finally looked up. The sight of so many strangers standing not for a celebrity, but for an ideal humility moved him deeply. His throat tightened, but he stayed quiet. Words would only diminish what silence had already said. On stage, Joel hesitated, unsure what to do next. He glanced toward Lisa, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Then, slowly, Joel began to clap. It was hesitant at first, then steady. The sound of his hands joined the congregation's applause, not as a leader commanding attention, but as a man finally letting go. In the media booth, the broadcast continued to roll, unedited and raw. Tina Alvarez kept filming, her camera lens trembling slightly as she zoomed out to capture the enormity of the moment. Elder Henry, by the pulpit, Joel clapping, Lisa in tears, and Keanu Reeves sitting humbly beneath the lights that once worshipped celebrity, but now reflected something divine. Later, when Tina's footage aired, she would call it the quiet sermon. The world would watch and wonder how stillness had upstaged spectacle, how silence had preached louder than any sermon ever could. But inside Lakewood, there were no headlines, yet only hearts, quietly opening. Elder Henry stepped down from the stage, his eyes glistening as he looked at Keanu one last time. "Thank you," he whispered. "More prayer than praise." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Don't thank me," he murmured. "I just sat down." The elder chuckled, his voice breaking with emotion. "Son, sometimes that's exactly what the Lord needs, someone willing to sit when the world tells him to stand." The lights dimmed naturally as the moment came to rest. No music played. No announcement followed. Just breath, stillness, and a room full of people who would never look at faith the same way again. The choir's final note faded into silence, and for a moment, no one knew what to do. The energy that had once filled Lakewood like a wave had vanished. The applause had stopped. The laughter had died. Even the rustle of the crowd felt muted, like a great hush settling over the room. Joel Osteen stood at the pulpit, still smiling, but the rhythm that had guided his voice all morning was gone. His practiced charm felt thin now, stretched over a moment that refused to obey his script. The spotlight that once obeyed his every gesture seemed to hesitate, as if unsure where to land. He cleared his throat, trying to recover his footing. "God moves in mysterious ways," he began, his voice warm but uncertain. "Sometimes, he reminds us that we are all part of something bigger, something beyond our plans." He paused, glancing toward the crowd, but their attention wasn't fully his anymore. In the front row, Lisa Osteen felt the shift deep in her chest. For years, she had stood beside her brother, supporting his ministry, believing in the message they shared. But today, something about this moment felt different. The sight of Keanu Reeves sitting calmly while 20,000 others clapped and cheered had struck her harder than she expected. It wasn't rebellion, it was reflection. His silence had forced everyone, even her, to question what they were doing. She looked up at Joel, saw the tension behind his perfect smile, and before she could stop herself, she rose to her feet. The movement drew immediate attention. She walked slowly toward the stage, gesturing to a nearby usher for a microphone. Joel turned, startled. "Lisa?" he said, half smiling, unsure what she intended. She took the mic gently, offering a reassuring nod. "Just for a moment," she said softly. The congregation's murmur grew louder, curiosity replacing the earlier excitement. Cameras shifted again, capturing her as she turned to face the audience. Her tone was different from her brother's, less polished, more human. "I want to say something," she began. "Something about what we just witnessed." She glanced toward the back of the room where Keanu sat, still calm, still silent. "Sometimes we confuse participation with performance. We stand, we clap, we shout, but we forget to listen." The crowd grew completely still. Joel's expression tightened, his eyes flicking toward the production booth. But he didn't interrupt. Lisa continued, her voice trembling with sincerity. "Maybe the truest form of worship isn't about how loud we sing or how high we raise our hands. Maybe it's about honesty, about presence, about being still long enough to feel something real." Her words landed softly, but their impact rippled through the hall. For the first time that morning, the room wasn't reacting, it was reflecting. Keanu lifted his gaze toward the stage. His eyes met Lisa's for just a moment. There was no smile, no nod, just a quiet understanding between two people who recognized the same truth. The silence in the hall deepened until even the faint hum of the sound system seemed intrusive. Lisa stood firm at the edge of the stage, the microphone resting loosely in her hand. She wasn't preaching. She was confessing. Her voice carried a kind of trembling honesty the congregation wasn't used to hearing in this grand arena of perfection. For so long, she continued, we've measured worship by emotion, by what we can see and hear. But what if faith isn't supposed to be visible? What if it's supposed to live quietly inside us, without all the noise? Others watched her, uneasy, as if afraid of where her words might lead. Joel Osteen remained frozen behind her, every instinct telling him to retake control. Yet something in Lisa's tone stopped him. He could sense the sincerity in her voice, the same kind of sincerity that had built their father's ministry, long before the lights and cameras came. Lisa's eyes swept over the crowd. We've turned this space into a stage, she said softly. But God doesn't need a performance. He just needs a heart willing to be honest. The tension in the air was electric. Even the choir stayed still, watching. Back in section 24, Keanu listened intently. He hadn't planned to draw attention, and yet his quiet presence had somehow opened a wound in this room, one that needed healing. Her words echoed what he had felt the moment he walked through the doors. He could feel something shifting, like a wall inside the church beginning to crack, letting the light in. Elder Henry, an old deacon who had served since the church's earliest days, sat a few rows from the front. His white hair caught the glow of the overhead lights, his weathered hands resting on a worn Bible. He had lived through the humble beginnings of Lakewood, when services were held in a modest building with creaky floors and folding chairs. Back then, worship was simple, just songs, prayers, and people crying quietly in the back rows. He had watched that simplicity disappear under bright lights and broadcast contracts. But as he listened to Lisa speak, tears filled his eyes. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, his voice carrying farther than expected. "Child," he said gently, "that's the truest word I've heard in years." The audience turned to look at him. His voice trembled, but it carried conviction. Maybe the Lord sent this man today to remind us of something we forgot, that faith doesn't need a spotlight to shine. Lisa's eyes softened. Joel's hand tightened on the pulpit, but he didn't speak. For the first time in a long while, the moment didn't belong to him. He hadn't come to teach, but somehow the message had found its way through the silence. The atmosphere inside Lakewood had changed completely. What had begun as a polished service had turned into something raw, unplanned, and deeply human. The lights no longer felt dazzling. The air was heavy with emotion and quiet awe. For the first time that morning, the church didn't feel like a performance hall. It felt like a sanctuary. Lisa stood beside her brother, her hand trembling slightly around the microphone. She looked at the congregation, some wiping tears, others simply staring, unsure of how to process what they were witnessing. "We talk about miracles all the time," she said softly. "But maybe the greatest miracle is honesty. Maybe it's when we finally stop pretending and let God see us as we really are." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Joel Osteen's perfect composure was fading. He didn't look angry. He looked unsure. For years, he had believed that positivity was the most powerful message he could offer. But now, standing behind his sister, he realized how fragile that image was, how thin the line between inspiration and illusion had become. He turned toward the audience, his polished voice returning but quieter now, almost hesitant. "My sister has spoken truth," he said. "Sometimes we need to be reminded that joy isn't performance, it's presence." The crowd listened in silence. Some nodded. Others whispered small prayers under their breath. In the far back, Keanu watched the exchange with calm focus. His eyes met Lisa's once again. The look between them carried no words, only understanding, a shared recognition that something real had finally broken through the surface. Elder Henry took a step forward, leaning heavily on his cane. His voice wavered, but it filled the space. "This church was built on faith, not fame," he said. "And today, I think the Lord gave us a small mercy to see that truth again." The room was utterly still. Even Joel felt the weight of the old man's words. They weren't an accusation. They were a plea, a reminder of what had been lost. Lisa handed the microphone back to her brother and stepped aside. Her expression was soft, tearful, yet relieved. Joel hesitated before taking it, staring at the crowd for a long, uncertain moment. The authority he once carried so easily was gone. In its place was something deeper, a dawning humility. He smiled faintly, not the rehearsed one that appeared on television, but something smaller, more human. "Let's take a moment," he said, voice unsteady, "to be still." No music played. No choir sang. 20,000 people sat in silence. For a full minute, the largest megachurch in America stood perfectly still. And in that stillness, Keanu Reeves bowed his head. He didn't preach, he didn't move, he didn't speak. Yet the quiet truth of his presence had done what no sermon ever could. The performance had ended. The faith remained. The silence lingered, fragile but sacred. Joel Osteen stood at the pulpit, unsure how to transition back into the structure of the community service. His words, once effortless, now felt small in this vast, humbled space. His instincts told him to regain control, to restore rhythm, to bring back the familiar order. But the congregation's stillness was heavy with something he didn't want to shatter. He looked toward his sister, Lisa, who nodded softly, encouraging him to let the moment breathe. Then his eyes fell on Elder Henry, the quiet, faithful servant who had been part of Lakewood long before it became a global phenomenon. The old man sat near the front, his cane resting across his knees, his face reflecting decades of devotion. Joel's heart stirred with both respect and desperation. "Elder Henry," Joel said, his voice echoing through the microphone, "would you come forward and lead us in prayer?" The elder blinked, surprised. Slowly, he rose, leaning on his cane as he made his way to the steps. The cameras followed him instinctively, broadcasting his careful ascent. Unlike the polished grace of Joel's stage presence, Henry's movements were unhurried, each step a testament to time and endurance. When he finally reached the pulpit, Joel handed him the microphone. "Thank you, Elder," he said softly. "Please share what's on your heart." Elder Henry nodded and turned to face the crowd. His voice was thin but steady, resonant with age and conviction. "I've seen a lot of Sundays here," he began. "I've seen this church grow from a few dozen believers in folding chairs to thousands filling this great hall. I've watched the music grow louder, the lights grow brighter, and the sermons reach millions. But somewhere along the way, I've wondered if the noise drowned out the whisper of God." A murmur spread through the crowd. His words, though gentle, struck deep. Henry smiled faintly, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "Today, I think I heard that whisper again, and it came from the quietest place in this room." The camera shifted toward the back section. People began to turn, realizing who he meant. Keanu Reeves, still seated in section 24, sat motionless, his hands folded, eyes lowered. He hadn't expected to be part of this, yet the moment found him again. "The man in the back row," Henry said, pointing gently, reminded us that faith doesn't need a spotlight to shine. The congregation gasped softly. Some clapped, others bowed their heads. Keanu remained still, his modest posture somehow amplifying the reverence in the room. Henry raised the Bible in his hand, his voice growing firmer. "Matthew, chapter 6, he said, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen." The verse filled the hall, like sunlight piercing through stained glass. Elder Henry's voice carried through the air with quiet strength. "Your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." He finished. The final words landed like a gentle blow, powerful in their simplicity. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, somewhere near the front, a woman began to clap. The sound echoed faintly in the massive space. Another person joined her, then another. Within seconds, applause began to ripple through the crowd. Not the synchronized, rehearsed rhythm Lakewood was used to, but something raw, unplanned, and real. The thunder of hands filled the sanctuary, rising higher and stronger. The cameras panned slowly across the faces of the congregation, capturing tears, smiles, and awe. There was no direction from the production team, no cue from the sound booth, just a spontaneous outpouring of emotion. For the first time in years, Lakewood's broadcast felt alive. Keanu bowed his head slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but refusing to interrupt the sacred moment. He wasn't used to being the center of reverence. Fame had taught him how shallow public adoration could be, but this was different. It wasn't about celebrity, it was about sincerity. He kept his gaze down, his hands clasped, feeling the strange mix of humility and weight that came with the moment. Elder Henry turned toward Joel, his eyes kind but steady. "Pastor," he said, "maybe today the sermon has already been preached." Joel stood motionless, his face tight with emotion. He had wanted to regain control, to lead again, but as he looked across the vast room, he realized control was no longer what the people needed. What they needed was truth, and they had found it in silence, not spectacle. Lisa's eyes shimmered with tears as she placed a hand over her heart. The simplicity of her brother's stillness and the elder's faith had combined into something holy. She knew the cameras were still rolling, but for once, that didn't matter. This wasn't about ratings, image, or growth. This was about awakening. In the production booth high above the stage, technicians exchanged bewildered glances. Their monitors glowed with scenes that felt foreign to Lakewood's usual broadcast. No musical transitions, no stage lights chasing emotion, no polished graphics flashing sermon points. Just people. Real people. One of them whispered to the director, "Do we cut to commercial?" The director hesitated, watching the live feed. On one screen, Joel stood humbled, beside Elder Henry. On another, Keanu sat in quiet reflection. The applause swelled, then softened, becoming a hum of reverence. The director shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Let it roll." Down on the main floor, a journalist named Tina Alvarez sat in the press section, clutching her camera. She had come expecting to film a typical Sunday segment, cheerful, glossy, predictable. But what she was capturing now was history in the making. Through her lens, she zoomed in on Keanu's face, the calm expression of a man unmoved by recognition, yet deeply present in faith. The light caught his, features just right. For once, it wasn't a movie shot. It was something pure. The applause faded into an almost sacred quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive. Joel looked out over the congregation, his heart pounding. He had preached to millions, stood on countless stages, but he had never felt what he felt now, small, human, and strangely free. The performance had ended, and something real had taken its place. Elder Henry lowered his Bible, his voice now soft again. "We've built walls of sound and light around something that was always meant to be simple," he said. "But today, I think we've remembered. Sometimes the smallest flame burns brighter than the biggest show." His hand trembled as he set the microphone on the pulpit. And that flame, brothers and sisters, came from a man who said nothing at all. All eyes turned once more to the back. Keanu sat motionless, trying to vanish into the seat, but there was no hiding from 20,000 eyes. He gave a single, slow nod, nothing theatrical, just acknowledgement, and the gesture carried through the entire arena. A few people began to stand, then more. Within seconds, hundreds rose to their feet, not in choreographed excitement, but in reverence. It wasn't a standing ovation for fame. It was for truth. Keanu finally looked up. The sight of so many strangers standing not for a celebrity, but for an ideal humility moved him deeply. His throat tightened, but he stayed quiet. On stage, Joel hesitated, unsure what to do next. He glanced toward Lisa, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Then, slowly, Joel began to clap. It was hesitant at first, then steady. The sound of his hands joined the congregation's applause, not as a leader commanding attention, but as a man finally letting go. In the media booth, the broadcast continued to roll, unedited and raw. Tina Alvarez kept filming, her camera lens trembling slightly as she zoomed out to capture the enormity of the moment. Elder Henry by the pulpit, Joel clapping, Lisa in tears, and Keanu Reeves sitting humbly beneath the lights that once worshipped celebrity, but now reflected something divine. Later, when Tina's footage aired, she would call it the quiet sermon. The world would watch and wonder how stillness had upstaged spectacle, how silence had preached louder than any sermon ever could. But inside Lakewood, there were no headlines, yet only hearts quietly opening. Elder Henry stepped down from the stage, his eyes glistening as he looked at Keanu one last time. "Thank you," he whispered. "More prayer than praise." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Don't thank me," he murmured. "I just sat down." The elder chuckled, his voice breaking with emotion. "Son, sometimes that's exactly what the Lord needs, someone willing to sit when the world tells him to stand." The lights dimmed naturally as the moment came to rest. No music played. No announcement followed. Just breath, stillness, and a room full of people who would never look at faith the same way again. The next morning, the Houston sky was pale and quiet, washed clean by the night's soft rain. A small cafe sat on a corner near the park, its front windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. It was early, too early for the morning rush. Only a few regulars filled the tables. Construction workers, students, a couple of elderly friends sharing coffee in silence. Keanu Reeves sat near the window, a plain mug in front of him, dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans. The same stillness from the church lingered in him, though here it felt more at peace. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, not because it needed it, but because he liked the rhythm of quiet hands in motion. The bell over the cafe door jingled softly. Joel Osteen stepped inside, wearing a casual blue jacket and dark slacks, looking far more human than the man who filled television screens each Sunday. When he spotted Keanu, he hesitated for a moment, then smiled, nervous but sincere. Keanu stood and offered a hand. "Morning, Pastor. Please," Joel said, shaking it. "After yesterday, just call me Joel." They both smiled and sat. The waitress approached, recognizing neither of them at first. Joel ordered black coffee, the simplest thing on the menu. There were no cameras, no microphones, no crowd waiting for meaning, just two men and the faint hiss of an espresso machine in the background. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, stretched out like morning light. Finally, Joel exhaled and leaned forward slightly. "I didn't sleep much last night," he said. "I kept replaying what happened, the silence, the faces, the way everything just stopped. I thought I understood faith, but now I'm not so sure." Keanu nodded, his gaze gentle. "Maybe that's where faith begins, when we stop being sure." Joel smiled faintly. "That sounds simple when you say it." "It's not," Keanu said. "I've spent half my life surrounded by applause. People cheer when you walk in a room, when you say the right words, even when you fake a smile. But applause is addictive. You start mistaking it for love. Then one day, When it's gone, you realize how quiet the world really is. Joel looked at him thoughtfully. You sound like someone who's been preaching longer than I have. Keanu chuckled softly. No preaching, just observation. Hollywood, religion, politics, it's all the same. Temptation, the need to be seen. Joel's eyes lowered. And when you're not, Keanu sipped his coffee. That's when you find out who you really are. The words landed heavy, like truth distilled through pain. Joel sat back, the weight of them sinking deep. He had spent his life teaching others to rise, to project confidence and joy. But this man, quiet, unadorned, honest, was teaching him how to fall gracefully into humility. Keanu glanced toward the window. The morning light hit his face, just enough to show the faint lines of weariness. The humanity behind the legend. The loudest prayers, he said quietly, are sometimes silent. Joel looked up. Yesterday proved that. Joel looked down at his coffee, his reflection rippling across the dark surface. You said something yesterday that stayed with me, he began. You said presence remains. I keep thinking about that. For years I've been chasing perfection, afraid that if I ever stopped smiling, people would stop believing. Keanu's expression softened. I understand that. When the world expects you to be perfect, imperfection feels like failure. But sometimes, showing your cracks helps others stop hiding theirs. Joel nodded slowly. I built a ministry on confidence. But yesterday, when I saw you sitting there, I realized how loud I'd become. I filled every quiet space with my own voice. Maybe that's why I couldn't hear God anymore. Keanu's tone was gentle but firm. Then maybe yesterday wasn't about losing control. Maybe it was about finding what you'd been missing. Joel looked up, his eyes searching Keanu's face. Control's always been my safety net. I thought if I could guide every moment, I could protect people from doubt, from pain. But faith isn't control, is it? Keanu shook his head. No, faith's what happens when you stop needing control. The words hit deep. Joel smiled faintly, a tired but genuine one. I envy that calm of yours. You carry silence like it's strength. Keanu chuckled. It didn't come easy. Silence used to scare me too. But I learned that it's not emptiness, it's space. The kind that lets you listen, or just be. Outside, the sun had risen higher, lighting up the window beside them. Dust motes floated through the air, catching the light as if suspended in time. For a moment, neither spoke. The world outside felt distant, quiet, merciful. Joel finally broke the silence. You know, yesterday, I thought I was supposed to teach, but it feels like I was the one being taught. Keanu smiled. Maybe we were both learning. I came to that church because I was curious about faith, not religion, but faith itself. I wanted to see if there was still room for sincerity in a place built on spectacle. And was there? Joel asked quietly. Keanu thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes, because sincerity always finds a way through, even when we try to hide it. Joel exhaled, a slow, unguarded breath. Thank you, he said sincerely. Not for what you did, but for what you didn't do. You didn't try to impress anyone. You just were. Keanu met his gaze. That's all any of us can do, Joel. Just be. They sat for a while longer, not as preacher and celebrity, but as two men who had finally found a piece of truth they could both live with. Outside, the streets began to fill with life again, but inside that little cafe, time seemed to move differently, slower, quieter, truer. When they finally stood to leave, Joel extended his hand once more. I hope this isn't our last conversation. Keanu shook his hand warmly. It's not, he said. Some conversations never end, they just grow quieter. By Monday morning, the video from Lakewood service had already gone viral. Every major news outlet replayed the moment, the silence, the applause, the bowed head of Keanu Reeves. Headlines ranged from admiration to criticism, but the church's media numbers had never been higher. Clips circulated with millions of views. Lakewood's name trended for the first time in years. Inside the glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the church complex, the staff gathered for their usual production meeting. Laptops glowed, screens displayed charts of engagement, and viewership spikes. And everyone was talking at once. The mood was electric, like the aftermath of a successful concert. 32 million views across platforms, one producer said, scrolling through his tablet. We're getting international coverage. Europe, South America, even Japan. Another added, CNN's calling it the day Lakewood went quiet. We've never had reach like this. We should plan a follow-up sermon to build on the momentum. Joel sat at the head of the table, listening but distant. He looked at the graphs, the metrics, the colorful proof of popularity, and felt nothing but unease. His hands rested on the polished wood, motionless. Lisa sat beside him, quietly watching her brother's face. Finally, Joel spoke, his voice soft but steady. What if we've been measuring the wrong things? The room went silent. Heads turned toward him. He glanced at the screens again. We talk about views, engagement, followers, but what about faith? Did anyone in this building actually feel what happened yesterday? Or are we just counting clicks? No one answered. The air grew heavy. One marketing manager cleared his throat nervously. Pastor, I think people felt inspired. The message was powerful. Joel interrupted gently. Whose message? Mine? He shook his head. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even spoken. It was silence. And that silence said more than all the words we've broadcast in years. Lisa's eyes softened. She had hoped he would say it. Joel leaned back in his chair. We've built this into a machine. Lights, music, timing, precision. It's impressive. But maybe we've been producing faith instead of living it. Someone from the technical team tried to laugh it off. Well, Pastor, production helps people connect. Without it, the experience... Joel raised a hand gently. I know, but maybe it's time to risk connection without control. He turned to the operations director. Cancel next week's lighting design. No stage effects, no music cues. We'll have one microphone, one piano, and natural light. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in panic. Pastor, we can't. The broadcast will suffer. The sponsors. Joel waited until the noise subsided. Just one Sunday, he said quietly. We'll trade performance for presence. The silence that followed was thicker than before. Lisa smiled faintly. I'll help make it happen. Joel nodded gratefully, then gestured toward the doorway. Marcus, he said. Marcus Hall, who had been standing outside, stepped into the room, startled. Join us, Joel said. I want every voice here, even the ones we never hear. Marcus hesitated, then took a seat. For the first time in Lakewood's history, the head of security sat at the table of leadership. The team stared at Marcus as he settled into the chair at the far end of the table. He was still wearing his uniform black shirt, earpiece coiled at his collar, posture straight but uncertain. He wasn't used to being inside meetings like this. His job had always been to protect, not to participate. Joel folded his hands and looked around the room. We've been running Lakewood like a corporation, he said quietly. And we've done it well. But yesterday proved something. We've been protecting the wrong thing. Marcus glanced up. What do you mean, Pastor? Joel smiled faintly. You protect people from threats, but maybe we've been protecting our image from truth. The words hung in the air. The media director shifted uncomfortably, his fingers frozen above his laptop keyboard. Lisa looked at her brother, pride and compassion mixing in her gaze. He was finally saying the thing she'd hoped he would say for years. Joel continued. Yesterday, a man walked in here and did what we've been trying to do for a decade. He made people feel something real, and he didn't say a word. The sound of the air conditioning filled the silence. No one dared interrupt. Lisa leaned forward. So what happens next? Joel took a deep breath. Next Sunday, we go back to where this began. No show, no spotlights, just people. The worship director looked pale. Pastor, without production, the broadcast will tank. We'll lose sponsors. Our reach will collapse. Joel nodded slowly. Then, let it collapse. If reach is built on noise, maybe it needs to fall quiet for a while. At the far end of the table, Marcus's lips curved into a small, rare smile. You're gonna shake the whole city, sir. Joel chuckled softly. Maybe it's time someone did. Lisa turned to Marcus. You saw what happened yesterday from the floor. What did you think? Marcus hesitated, then spoke with a careful honesty of a man unused to microphones. I think people came to be moved, not managed. Yesterday they finally were. The room went quiet again. Joel nodded, visibly moved. That's exactly it. Outside the conference room door, journalist Tina Alvarez stood quietly, recording notes on her phone. She hadn't planned to linger, but the muffled voices drew her in. Through the glass, she could see Joel's face, not the performer's smile, but a man stripped of pretense. For the first time, she understood she wasn't witnessing another viral story. She was witnessing a turning point. Joel's voice lowered. We'll simplify everything. No fog machines, no rehearsed applause, just faith and the people who bring it. Joel looked up, his voice steady. Then we'll have failed honestly. That's more than I can say for our success. Lisa placed a hand over her brother's. It won't fail, she said softly, because people are ready to stop watching and start feeling again. Marcus nodded in agreement, his voice barely above a whisper. Faith doesn't need protection anymore. It just needs to breathe. Joel smiled, a quiet peace in his eyes. Then that's what we'll give it. As the meeting ended, the staff filed out slowly, uncertain but thoughtful. Tina stayed behind, writing a single line in her notes before slipping away. Lakewood is about to trade performance for presence. Sunday morning arrived with a pale Texas sunrise, soft light spreading across the wide parking lots of Lakewood Church. From the outside, the massive building looked the same as always, modern, gleaming, full of expectation. But inside, everything had changed. There were no bright spotlights waiting to ignite, no massive LED screens flashing countdowns or theme verses. The production booths were empty except for a few stunned technicians sitting quietly, unsure if they should even touch the controls. The giant stage had been dismantled overnight, replaced by something shockingly simple. A wide circle of chairs arranged on the main floor. No pulpit, no microphones, no orchestra pit. By 8 o'clock, people began to file in. At first, they whispered in confusion, looking around for the familiar lights, the choir, the ushers with their headsets. Parents hushed their children, unsure if the service had been delayed. Some laughed nervously. Others sat cautiously, waiting for someone to process. Explain. Lisa Osteen stood near the entrance, greeting people as they came in. She wore no makeup, no microphone, just a calm smile. Elder Henry sat near the front, his cane resting on his knee, watching everything with quiet pride. The old man knew what this was. It wasn't a new program. It was a return to what had been lost. Joel arrived not through the side doors or the stage entrance, but through the same doors as everyone else. He wore plain clothes, an untucked white shirt, and jeans. The congregation gasped softly when they recognized him. He didn't wave or speak. He just smiled and walked slowly to one of the chairs in the circle. Marcus stood near the back, eyes scanning the crowd but heart strangely calm. He had guarded 1,000 services before, But this one felt different. It didn't need protection, it needed peace. Then, quietly, Keanu Reeves entered. No one had announced his coming. No cameras had been invited. He walked in, wearing the same black hoodie and jeans. As before, his hands tucked in his pockets. People turned as he passed. But there was no whisper of celebrity now. They knew what his presence meant. He took the same seat as last time, section 24, near the back. Joel waited until the murmuring had died down. Then, without standing or using a microphone, he spoke. His voice was gentle but clear enough to reach the nearby rows. "Good morning," he said simply. "Today, we're going to do something we've forgotten how to do. We're going to listen." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Joel smiled faintly. "There's no sermon today. No music. No message. Just presence. We've been performing for too long. Today, we'll stop performing and start listening to God, to ourselves, to one another." He sat back down, folding his hands. For a few awkward moments, the crowd shifted in their seats. People coughed, shuffled, whispered. The quiet was foreign, uncomfortable. Without noise, they didn't know where to look. But slowly, something in the air began to settle. The discomfort gave way to calm, and then came silence. The silence began as a fragile thing, thin as glass. A few people fidgeted, unsure how long it would last. But as seconds turned into minutes, the stillness deepened until even the restless ones gave in. The sound of breath replaced the hum of machinery. The enormous hall built for sound and spectacle had never known such quiet. Elder Henry bowed his head, whispering a wordless prayer. Lisa closed her eyes, tears forming before she knew why. Around the room, shoulders relaxed, hands unclenched. For the first time, the church wasn't performing. It was simply being. Keanu sat motionless near the back, his eyes closed, breathing slow and even. He felt the weight of the moment, not as a participant, but as someone witnessing something sacred being born. His presence no longer stood out. It blended into the quiet rhythm of the crowd. Minutes passed. Somewhere near the quad front, a child began to cry softly. Instead of shushing him, his mother held him close, her own tears falling silently. That single, human sound, uncontrolled, unpolished, broke the tension. The room seemed to breathe together after that. A murmur of sniffles, a few soft sobs, but still no words, only feeling. Joel opened his eyes and looked around. His heart felt raw and unguarded. He could see it in the faces of his people, the same ones who used to cheer at his sermons, now stripped of every layer of performance. They weren't responding to him anymore. They were responding to something greater, something real. He stood slowly, not to speak, but to walk among them. No one clapped. No one reached for a camera. He simply moved quietly through the circle of chairs, placing a gentle hand on shoulders, nodding to strangers he'd never truly seen before. Lisa rose and joined him, taking the opposite side of the circle. She greeted the congregation with silent smiles, her tears glistening in the morning light. Elder Henry leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, whispering, This is worship." Time lost its shape. 10 minutes might have passed, or 50. No one seemed to care. The energy in the room was no longer restless. It was grounded. It was peace. Keanu finally opened his eyes. Across the room, Joel looked up at him. Their gazes met, and for a heartbeat, everything came full circle. No words passed between them, but both men knew what had been accomplished. The church had found its soul again. Joel raised his voice for the first time, soft but steady. You can keep your eyes closed if you wish," he said gently. "You can pray, you can weep, you can just breathe. God hears all of it." And then he fell silent again. No music swelled, no applause followed. Yet something profound moved through the room like wind through open doors. Tears glistened on faces across the vast space. People reached for one another, not as strangers in pews, but as equals in silence. For the first time in years, Lakewood wasn't a performance, it was a prayer. The silence didn't end, it evolved. What began as stillness now breathed with quiet movement. A low murmur rose from somewhere near the front, a woman whispering a prayer to herself. Her voice trembled at first, barely audible, then grew steadier. Another voice joined hers, then another. Soon the great hall was filled with soft prayers spoken in different rhythms, tones, and languages, a tapestry of sound woven out of sincerity. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't led, it simply happened. Elder Henry lifted his head and looked around the circle. His old eyes filled with tears as he saw something he hadn't seen in decades, people worshiping without direction. He reached for the Bible resting on his lap, then set it aside. The Word, he thought, was already alive among them. At that moment, a woman, in a plain blue dress, stood from the crowd. Her hair was graying, her hands trembling slightly. She hesitated before walking toward the open space in the center of the circle. The congregation turned to watch her, uncertain. There had always been invisible boundaries in Lakewood, the stage, the leaders, the audience. But now, there was no stage to separate anyone. The woman stopped at the empty chair in the center and laid her hand on it. "I don't know if I belong here," she whispered. Her voice broke, but her words carried. "But I need to pray for my son." No one told her to sit. No one told her to move. Elder Henry stood slowly and approached her. His cane tapped softly against the floor as he reached her side. He placed his hand gently over hers. "You do belong," he said. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, people around the room began to rise and move toward the center. A young father, a teenage girl, an elderly couple, they all came forward, filling the circle, their hands finding one another's naturally. Within minutes, the congregation had formed a massive, unbroken ring that stretched across the sanctuary. Lisa Osteen felt her breath catch as she took Elder Henry's other hand. Tears streamed down her face freely now. For so long, she had stood on a platform, separated by lights and distance. But now she was shoulder to shoulder with her people, no hierarchy, no walls, no show. Joel looked around, overwhelmed. It wasn't chaos, it was communion. He had prayed for revival for years, not realizing it would come through silence, not sound. Slowly he stepped into the circle and knelt beside the woman in blue. He lowered his head and began to pray, his voice barely above a whisper. "Teach us to listen," he said softly. "Teach us to hear what cannot be spoken." The room answered not with words, but with tears. At the back, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his head bowed. He didn't move, didn't stand, didn't speak. He just watched, the faintest smile touching his lips. What he saw wasn't religion. It was humanity, rediscovering its heartbeat. The transformation had begun. The sound inside the hall deepened, not loud, but alive. Soft prayers intertwined with quiet sobs, the air thick with reverence. Joel stayed on his knees, surrounded by his congregation, his eyes closed. For the first time, he wasn't leading, he was part of something far greater. His words were few, but they carried through the stillness. "We've spent years talking to God," he said softly. "Maybe now it's time to let him talk to us." No one clapped. No one shouted amen. But something unseen passed through the room, a collective release, like thousands of hearts exhaling at once. Lisa knelt beside her brother, her hand resting on his shoulder. She looked around at the circle that now spanned the sanctuary: black, white, rich, poor, young, old, every difference erased in the glow of shared stillness. She whispered through tears, "This is what church was meant to be." Elder Henry squeezed her hand, his eyes bright despite his age. "It took a long time to remember," he said softly. Tina Alvarez stood near the back of the hall, her camera trembling in her hands. She had covered hundreds of church events, celebrity sermons, and grand productions. But this was different. She zoomed in on Joel, his face streaked with tears, and then panned toward the congregation. 20,000 souls, connected not by spectacle, but by spirit. Her own tears blurred the lens. She lowered the camera for a moment, unable to see clearly. She had planned to document an unusual service. Instead, she had stumbled upon a miracle. Keanu remained seated, hands clasped, watching the chain of connection spread through the crowd. He didn't smile for the cameras or wave to anyone. He simply breathed it in, his gaze soft, peaceful. In that moment, he felt invisible, and it was exactly what he wanted. He had been the spark, but now the flame burned on its own. Elder Henry lifted his voice. Once more, his tone quiet, but firm. "If faith was sleeping," he said, "it's awake now." A ripple of emotion moved through the people. Hands tightened in the circle. Some bowed their heads. Others looked upward through tears. The silence returned, not his absence, but his presence, warm, whole, holy. Outside the glass walls of Lakewood, reporters and onlookers gathered, expecting noise. But when they peeked through the doors, what they saw was something that didn't need headlines. 20,000 people holding hands in a vast circle of peace. The cameras inside rolled quietly. Tina kept filming, her lens steady again. She whispered to herself, "The day Lakewood listened." She knew the name before the story was even written. In the back, Keanu stood slowly, bowing his head once more before slipping out unnoticed. No one turned. No one needed to. His presence had already done its work. As he stepped into the sunlight outside, the sounds of the city washed over him. Distant traffic, birds, the murmur of life continuing. He smiled faintly, knowing the silence inside would echo far beyond those walls. Inside, Joel looked up from his prayer and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us who we are." And in that moment, Lakewood wasn't a megachurch. It was a family rediscovering its faith. By Monday morning, the world was talking. The day Lakewood listened had spread across every major platform. Clips flooded social media, people holding hands, praying in silence. The absence of spectacle that somehow became the most powerful message of all. Hashtags trended in multiple countries. Some called it revival. Others called it rebellion. But most agreed it was real. Inside Lakewood's conference room, the staff gathered again, this time in near silence. The atmosphere was nothing like before. No bright screens, no laughter, no bragging over numbers. Just quiet reflection. Joel sat at the head of the table with Lisa beside him, her notebook closed. Even the digital graphs on the wall seemed muted, as if the data itself knew it had lost meaning. The analytics director finally broke the stillness. "Attendance dropped 20%, he said. "Some people left confused. Some left inspired. But," he hesitated, "donations have gone up. A lot. People are giving more than ever before." Joel nodded slowly, taking it in. "That makes sense," he said softly. "Maybe people are finally giving from the heart, not habit." Lisa smiled faintly. "I think people felt something honest. You can't buy that." Another staff member leaned forward. "The media is calling it the authentic Sunday. Even the networks that usually mock us are showing respect. They said it looked like faith rediscovering itself." Joel let out a small laugh under his breath. Imagine that. We spent years trying to be seen. Turns out all we had to do was be still. There was a pause before Marcus Hall spoke up from the far end of the table. He'd been invited again, an unspoken sign of new trust. His deep voice carried calm authority. "Pastor, I've stood guard through hundreds of services. I've seen lights, music, shouting, even tears. But that silence yesterday, it felt more like God than all our sound put together." Heads turned toward him. He wasn't used to speaking in these meetings, but no one interrupted. Joel nodded, deeply moved. "That's the truth, Marcus. For years, we tried to reach people by being louder. But maybe God doesn't need us to raise our voices. Maybe He needs us to lower them." Lisa's eyes filled with quiet pride. "The question is, what do we do now?" Joel looked around the room. "We let it change us. We stop chasing scale and start seeking substance. What if success isn't width, it's depth?" The phrase lingered in the air. Someone wrote it down without being told. Across the table, the communications manager opened her laptop. "There's a quote trending everywhere," she said. "People are sharing something Keanu said when asked about the service." Joel raised an eyebrow. "What did he say?" She smiled faintly. "He said, 'The greatest strength is to stand still when the world demands movement.'" The room fell quiet again. Everyone seemed to feel the weight of those words. Joel leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then maybe stillness is our new direction." The team sat in thoughtful silence. The hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of traffic outside filled the space where once there had been endless chatter about metrics and production schedules. Joel glanced around the table, his eyes soft but resolute. "Maybe it's time," he said, "to start leading like we used to believe, before all of this became a business." Lisa looked at him, her voice warm but firm. "If you're serious about that, it's going to mean change. Real change. Fewer shows, smaller stages, shared voices." Joel nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." Elder Henry, seated beside her, smiled faintly. "Son, it's about time." His old hands rested on his cane. "Your father used to say the church grows best when it forgets it's supposed to grow." Joel chuckled softly, emotion glinting in his eyes. "I think Dad would have liked yesterday." "He would have loved it," Henry replied. The creative director leaned forward cautiously. "If we simplify, we'll lose sponsors. Some of the staff may walk." Joel turned toward him. "Then, they'll walk. But I'd rather have 50 people who feel something real than 50,000 chasing an illusion." Marcus nodded quietly at the end of the table. The silence showed us what's left when everything else is gone. Maybe that's what people have been missing. The words settled over the team like a benediction. For the first time in years, they weren't strategizing, they were reflecting. Joel stood, walking slowly to the large glass window that overlooked Houston's skyline. Morning light spilled across the room, washing over his face. "We've been shining lights so bright that we couldn't see our own reflection. From now on, Lakewood's light will come from something smaller, something real." He turned back to his staff, voice steady and clear. "Starting next month, we're redesigning the sanctuary. No more stage separation. The choir will sit among the congregation. The pulpit will be replaced with a table. We'll lead together, not from above." Lisa smiled through tears. "That's the Lakewood our father dreamed of." Joel nodded. "And it's the one we'll become again." Tina Alvarez, who had been invited to document the meeting, lowered her camera for a moment. She had seen powerful images before, but this felt different. There was no performance, no pretense, just conviction. She pressed record again quietly, knowing history was unfolding in front of her. Joel's voice softened. "We've been asking people to believe in us. It's time we start believing in them." The team exchanged glances, some uncertain, others inspired, but no one argued. Something had shifted permanently. Lisa reached for her brother's hand. "Let's make humility our new tradition." He squeezed her hand and smiled. "That's the policy." Elder Henry laughed softly. "Now that's a policy I can live with." As the meeting adjourned, Joel lingered behind, staring out at the city below. The skyline shimmered in the morning sun, alive with movement and noise. Yet somewhere deep inside, he felt the peace of stillness, the same quiet that had changed everything. And with that, the transformation of Lakewood truly began. Months passed, and Lakewood Church looked and felt like a different place. Gone were the blinding lights, the massive screens, and the time transitions that once filled every second of service. In their place was open space, soft, natural light, and a circle of chairs where people could see each other instead of staring up at a distant stage. The air itself felt different, slower, gentler, real. Attendance wasn't breaking records anymore. Some Sundays were smaller, quieter, but those who came stayed longer. People no longer rushed for the exits when the music ended. They lingered, prayed with strangers, held hands, and talked long after the service was over. It was no longer a show to watch. It had become a community to belong to. Joel often arrived early now, walking through the hall before anyone else. He liked the stillness, the soft echo of his steps, the sunlight creeping across the floor. Each time he walked past the empty chairs, he remembered the first silent Sunday when 20,000 people had rediscovered what faith could sound like. Lisa oversaw new community circles where members shared stories instead of sermons. People who had once sat in the back row began leading prayer discussions. The walls that fame and structure had built slowly dissolved. For the first time, Lakewood wasn't defined by how many watched it, was defined by how many felt. The media kept calling, wanting interviews, wanting to capture the miracle of the quiet church. Most requests Joel declined, but one morning he finally agreed to a short press conference, held in the same simplified hall that had become their new sanctuary. Reporters gathered around, cameras rolling, waiting for a headline. Joel stepped up to the center. No podium, no notes. His voice was calm, almost intimate. "People have been asking what happened to Lakewood," he said. "The answer is simple. Keanu Reeves didn't disrupt our church. He healed it." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The quote would echo across every network within hours, but Joel didn't flinch. "He reminded us," he continued, "that faith was never supposed to be a production. It was supposed to be presence." And that reminder changed everything. From the front row, Lisa nodded through tears. Elder Henry smiled faintly, his weathered hands clasped. The old deacon had started calling Keanu the quiet reformer, and the name had begun to spread through the congregation. It wasn't worship or fandom, it was gratitude. Meanwhile, Keanu remained in Houston for several months, quietly filming a new project. Most Sundays, he slipped into the back of the church, wearing his same black hoodie, sitting without attention. Sometimes he stayed for an hour. Sometimes he left before anyone noticed. But whenever he came, the congregation seemed to sense it, not because he was a star, but because stillness followed him like a shadow. The movement that began inside Lakewood didn't stay there. Within weeks, smaller churches across Texas started holding their own quiet Sundays. They turned off the lights, lowered their sound systems, and gathered in circles instead of rows. Photos began circulating online, congregations sitting hand in hand, pastors kneeling beside their members instead of above them. Someone tagged one of the photos with the hashtag number Authentic Faith, and it spread like wildfire. Within months, it became a national conversation. The hashtag appeared on screens from Seattle to Miami, from small-town chapels to massive arenas. Worship. Leaders debated it, pastors studied it, but the people embraced it. It wasn't rebellion, it was return. A return to simplicity, to sincerity, to something older than all the noise. When Joel saw it trending for the first time, he felt no pride, only peace. He sat in his office with the blinds open, watching sunlight filter through. Lisa entered quietly with a printout of an article from the Washington Post. The headline read, "The Lakewood Effect: How One Silent Sunday Sparked a Nationwide Shift in Faith." Joel smiled faintly as he read. "It's strange," he said, "how the smallest sound can reach the farthest distance." Lisa nodded. "You didn't start this. You just stopped long enough for people to hear themselves again." Elder Henry, sitting nearby, chuckled softly. "And that, my dear, is the gospel in motion." Down the street, Tina Alvarez finished editing her documentary, The Day Lakewood Listened. It had no narration, no dramatic music, just real moments. She let the silence speak. When it aired, viewers around the world watched and wept. In a world obsessed with spectacle, Lakewood's quiet revolution felt like grace. Through it all, Keanu Reeves remained silent. Reporters hunted for interviews, hoping for a statement, a quote, anything. But he always declined politely. Occasionally, someone would spot him in Houston buying coffee, walking to set, or slipping into the back of a Sunday gathering. His quiet presence had become its own kind of legend. One afternoon, a journalist finally caught up with him outside a studio. She asked about Lakewood, about the viral movement his name had become attached to. Keanu smiled politely and shook his head. "I didn't teach anything," he said. "They already knew. I just reminded them to listen." The quote spread like light. Through stained glass, simple, perfect, unforgettable. At Lakewood, Joel had it printed on the wall above the main entrance. Visitors stopped to read it. Each Sunday before walking inside, beneath the quote were smaller words. He added later, "Silence is not absence, it's awareness." Months after that first quiet Sunday, Joel stood once again in the middle of the sanctuary, now redesigned entirely. There was no pulpit, no elevated platform. The floor was open, and people gathered in small clusters. Families, strangers, friends. No one needed direction anymore. The worship had become self-sustaining, organic, alive. Lisa walked up beside him, arms crossed, smiling. "You think it'll last?" she asked. Joel looked around the hall, the soft light, the peaceful murmur of prayer, the community that had rediscovered its heart. "If it's real," he said, "it doesn't need to last. It just needs to live." Elder Henry joined them, leaning on his cane, eyes sparkling. "And live it will, as long as people remember to stop talking long enough to hear." In the back, unnoticed as always, Keanu sat with his head bowed, the same quiet presence that started it all. No cameras, no spotlight, just the sound of peace filling the air. And as the church prayed, their voices low and uncoordinated but full of meaning, one truth echoed silently between them all. Faith had finally learned how to listen again. 1 year later, Lakewood looked nothing like the gleaming monument it once was. The stage was gone. The lights were warm and dim. The walls no longer displayed grand verses or flashy graphics, just a single phrase painted in soft gold letters. "Be still and listen." Outside, the morning sun fell over the modest line of people entering through the same doors Joel now used every Sunday. There were fewer than before, but each face carried intention. People came not to watch, but to participate. Some brought their children, others came alone, but all came seeking the same thing: presence. Inside, the chairs still formed the same open circle. No one sat higher or closer than anyone else. Lisa greeted people with hugs instead of microphones. Elder Henry, older now but still steady, sat near the front with his cane resting against his leg, eyes shining with quiet pride. Joel stood near the center of the circle, holding a folded piece of paper. His hair had grayed slightly, but there was a softness to him now, a calm that hadn't been there in years. When the room settled, he smiled and said, "A year ago today, this church fell silent. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than every word I'd ever preached." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, gentle and knowing. Joel nodded, then unfolded the paper in his hands. "I want to read you something," he said. "It's a letter we received last week." He began reading, his voice steady. "Dear Pastor Joel, I left Lakewood 3 years ago. I was tired of the noise, the lights, the feeling that church had become a show. But last year, I saw a clip online, 20,000 people sitting in silence. I watched the whole thing with tears running down my face. It reminded me why I believed in the first place. The next Sunday, I sat on my porch and prayed for the first time in years. Not out loud, just quietly. I realized I never needed to leave. God, He'd never left me. Thank you for helping me remember. Sincerely, Angela." Joel paused, the emotion catching in his throat. The crowd sat in perfect stillness, every word absorbed like sunlight through glass. He folded the letter carefully, holding it against his chest. "That," he said softly, "is what this past year has been about. Not growth, not numbers. Just moments like that, one heart rediscovering its faith." From the back of the room, Keanu Reeves sat quietly once more, dressed simply, head slightly bowed. He hadn't been announced or acknowledged, but those who noticed him simply smiled. His presence no longer caused whispers. It was part of the place now, as natural as the morning light streaming through the high windows. Joel glanced toward him for a brief moment, then back to the circle. "The man who once sat quietly among us taught us that faith doesn't need microphones," he said. "Sometimes, silence is the loudest praise of all." The congregation nodded, many in tears. When the service ended, no one rushed to leave. People lingered as they always did now, speaking softly, praying with one another, and embracing in quiet gratitude. Elder Henry rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and made his way toward the back. He stopped beside Lisa and whispered, "Do you feel it? It's not a crowd anymore. It's a family." Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening. "That's all we ever wanted." At the far side of the circle, Joel finished greeting a few congregants, then looked across the hall. He saw Keanu standing near the back door, just as he had 1 year ago. Their eyes met, and Joel smiled softly. He walked toward him, unhurried, his steps echoing lightly against the floor. The crowd parted gently to let him through, but there was no spectacle, no cameras, just mutual respect. When Joel reached him, Keanu offered a humble nod. "Thank you for coming," Joel said quietly. "I didn't know if you'd be here." Keanu smiled faintly. "I'm still in town for a bit. Thought I'd stop by and listen again." Joel chuckled softly. "You've started a habit we can't seem to quit." Keanu tilted his head, his eyes kind. "Maybe it's a good habit." They both laughed quietly, and then Joel's tone softened. "You know, a year ago, I thought I was losing everything. Control, confidence, direction. But now, I think I was just making room for something better." Keanu nodded, his voice calm as ever. "Sometimes we have to lose noise to find meaning." Joel looked down for a moment, his expression sincere. "I wanted to thank you for what you did, for what your silence gave us." Keanu shook his head. "I didn't give anything. The light you found was already here. You just had to let it in." Joel was quiet for a long moment, moved by the truth of it. Then he extended his hand. Keanu took it, and they stood there in mutual understanding, teacher and student, the roles now blurred, each learning from the other. "Take care of this place," Keanu said softly. "It's rare to find a space that listens." "I will," Joel replied. "And thank you for reminding us how." As they let go, Lisa and Elder Henry watched from across the hall, both smiling. Henry whispered to her, "That man never preached a sermon, but he changed one forever." Lisa nodded. "Maybe that's the purest kind of sermon." Keanu slipped out quietly afterward, unnoticed by most. Outside, the day was bright and peaceful. He put on his sunglasses and walked toward his car, blending easily into the flow of life around him. No one stopped him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Inside, Joel returned to the center of the circle, looking at the faces still gathered there. "Let's close with silence," he said softly. Everyone bowed their heads. The hall grew quiet again, filled with light and breath and peace. The same peace that had begun a year ago with one man who refused to perform. And as the silence deepened, it became clear to all who were there. Lakewood had found not just faith, but its heartbeat. The next morning, Houston's air was soft and still, the kind that seems to hold its breath between dawn and day. A quiet terminal at the airport buzzed with low conversation, rolling suitcases, and muted announcements echoing through glass and steel. Keanu Reeves sat by the window near Gate 17, a worn leather notebook open on his lap. Outside, a silver plane idled on the tarmac, heat rippling behind its engines. He watched it without hurry, pen poised above the page. His handwriting was small, careful. On the first line, he wrote, "Silence speaks louder than applause." He looked at the words for a long time, as though weighing their truth. Then he closed the notebook gently, slipping it into his jacket. He wasn't thinking about fame or headlines, though both had followed him since Lakewood's transformation. Every media outlet wanted his statement, but he gave none. He had come to Houston quietly, and he would leave the same way. Nearby, a family recognized him, but didn't approach. The mother smiled softly instead, as if understanding something deeper, that not every presence needed acknowledgement. Keanu returned her smile, grateful. As his flight was called, he rose and walked toward the gate. No entourage, no cameras. Just a man traveling alone with a small carry-on bag and a peace that came from somewhere deeper than achievement. Back in Houston, the city stirred to life. The morning sunlight poured through the redesigned glass walls of Lakewood Church. Workers were setting up chairs in a circle again, preparing for the weekly service. The building had changed, but more importantly, the people had changed. Gone were the booming speakers and flashing screens. In their place were soft voices, hands joined in prayer, and genuine conversation. Lisa Osteen stood at the entrance, greeting families as they arrived. She no longer wore the formal suits she used to. Today, she wore a simple cream sweater and a smile that reached her eyes. Elder Henry joined her, walking slowly but confidently, his cane tapping lightly on the tile. "1 year," he said quietly, "and the silence still speaks." Lisa nodded. "It's become our rhythm now." The broadcast booth upstairs had fewer people than ever before. Tina Alvarez, once a reporter, now worked as part of the team, not producing a show, but documenting moments for history. She adjusted her small handheld camera, recording without commentary. Her footage told a story words couldn't. Across the country, small churches continued to follow Lakewood's example. Wooden chairs replaced rows of theater seats. Acoustic guitars replaced orchestras. Congregations sat closer together, prayed longer, and spoke less. The movement had no official leader, no logo, no name beyond what people called it online. The day Lakewood listened. In the weeks after, Joel Osteen had received letters from across the world from priests, pastors, and everyday believers. They all said the same thing in different words. We remembered what it feels like to be still. He often reread them before stepping onto the floor each Sunday. Not to prepare a message, but to remember one. The afternoon sun slanted across the stained glass panels, scattering color across the circle of gathered faces. Joel sat among them, no stage separating him from his congregation. His Bible rested closed on his lap. He didn't need notes anymore. He began to speak softly. For a long time, we measured faith by noise. We thought God lived in the sound, in the cheers, in the lights. But then someone showed us what happens when we stop performing. A hush settled over the crowd, the kind that didn't demand silence. It invited it. Joel looked around the circle, meeting eyes one by one. When the noise stopped, we finally heard something worth listening to. People nodded, some in tears. Elder Henry smiled faintly, Lisa's hand resting on his arm. Around them, the sanctuary pulsed with quiet life children, whispering prayers, strangers embracing, moments unplanned yet sacred. Joel continued, his tone humble. The man who taught us this never preached, never shouted, never asked for a spotlight. He simply sat still and reminded us what faith used to feel like. At that same moment, thousands of miles away, Keanu's plane crossed over the Pacific. The clouds below lit gold by the setting sun. He looked out the window, a calm expression on his face. The flight attendant offered him coffee. He accepted, thanking her quietly. He reached into his jacket and opened his notebook again. Beneath his earlier line, he added a few words more. Humility doesn't weaken the powerful. It reveals who they really are. He paused, reread the sentence, and smiled, faintly. It was enough. He didn't need to say it aloud. The montage of what he left behind played out across the world, smaller churches filled with laughter and prayer, pastors kneeling with their people, and Lakewood's circle growing not in numbers but in depth. The story had become a mirror, showing believers what they had forgotten, that holiness often hides in simplicity. In one church in Oregon, a young pastor quoted Joel's words from that first silent Sunday. In another, a group of children in Alabama gathered around a table writing their own prayers in silence before reading them aloud. What began as one quiet act had become a movement without borders, spreading like light through an open window. Back in Houston, Joel often ended his gatherings with the same reflection. He would close his eyes and say, "The loudest praise isn't sung, it's lived." Then, as always, he would let the silence fall, and everyone understood. For those who had been there on that first day, the memory remained sharp. The moment a man refused to stand, and the world learned to listen. And so this story closes not with applause, but with quiet truth, one that doesn't fade because it never sought attention. If this incredible story moved you, share it with someone who believes the world still needs kindness. Tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed a moment where silence spoke louder than words?